In 2005, a little game called Resident Evil 4 came out, and a specific man played it. He loved the game so much, he decided that it would serve as an example of the gameplay he wanted to achieve with his upcoming project at work, a sci-fi horror game. That man's name is Glenn Schofield, and he and his team at EA Redwood Shores would soon make the original Dead Space, released in 2008. It was a huge success, and the studio was rebranded to Visceral Games and given the go-ahead to produce a sequel, Dead Space 2, which saw even greater sales and critical acclaim than its predecessor. It seemed like smooth sailing, with both games being undeniable hits, one after the other. But then the third game happened. Dead Space 3, while having its moments, very clearly steered away from some of the ideas that made the first two games so popular. This new direction did not please fans, and ultimately, the series was slowly phased out of EA's pipeline. Visceral would go on to make Battlefield Hardline, which saw mixed but generally positive reception, and would then be given the opportunity to work on a Star Wars game, named Project Ragtag at the time. Sadly, the studio was unceremoniously closed down, and the game was cancelled. With this, all of Visceral's franchises were left to collect dust, including their flagship series, Dead Space, the series that turned them into one of EA's best teams and gave them their name. The Dead Space IP would lay dormant for years, with fans both old and new revisiting it and hoping for a new entry or successor somehow, somewhere. Then, in July of 2021, it happened. A remake of the first game was announced at an EA Play event developed by Motive Studio, whose history at the time only included Star Wars Squadrons and supporting development for Battlefront 2. Why did Dead Space need a remake anyway, when it holds up so well all these years later? And could this young studio truly make a game that lived up to the modern classic? Some people didn't think so. In fact, there was a strong discourse among many that they wouldn't support the remake simply out of principle because of how badly Visceral Games was treated by EA. I wonder what game those people are playing right now. That aside, a lot of people actually expected the Callisto Protocol to be the true successor, because it was the game made by the actual former Dead Space developers, including Schofield himself. Thus, why wouldn't it be a good follow-up? Well, that game released in early December, and it was divisive to say the least. It was clear that the game had nothing in common with Dead Space besides the fact that it was also sci-fi horror. And so, the tide shifted, and people began to pull for the Dead Space remake being as good as they hoped. So, was it? Well, I played the game and I finished it, and now I want to talk about it. So let's get into the review. Dead Space takes place in the distant future, the year 2508, a time where humanity has left the confines of Earth and spread out to explore the galaxy. Technology has advanced to the point where we've created massive ships called planet crackers to break open barren worlds and harvest them for resources. One of these cracked planets is Aegis 7, and its designated planet cracker is the USG Ishimura. The crew of the Kellion pays a visit to the ship to investigate a distress call, expecting little more than perhaps a systems failure of some sort. But when they arrive, they find the Ishimura practically abandoned, with signs that someone or something has infiltrated it. Soon they encounter the Necromorphs, mutated monstrosities that were once members of the Ishimura crew. Together, they must find a way to escape the ship while also uncovering the mystery of how its inhabitants turned into such horrific creatures and how it's all related to a monolithic marker found on Aegis 7 and the cult-like Church of Unitology that worships it. The main character of the game is Isaac Clarke, who is going on this mission to begin with because his girlfriend, Nicole Brennan, is also a member of the Ishimura. Isaac himself has seen a ton of changes in this iteration of the game compared to the original. First is his face. He's now modeled after his voice actor, Gunnar Wright, who was in Dead Space 2 and 3. Second is the fact that Isaac now speaks in this game. He never said a word in the original Dead Space aside from the various grunts and groans he uttered when fighting. I understand that that was a deliberate choice to help players project themselves onto Isaac better, but it always struck me as very, very odd that a person would be trapped in such hellish circumstances and never say a single goddamn thing. Honestly, I think having Isaac talk this time around is a good change. It's a change that might as well have been made anyway since he speaks in the sequels. And Isaac's dialogue in this remake is still somewhat minimal. A big annoyance with a lot of AAA single-player games, especially open-world ones, is chatty main characters who don't stop talking to themselves. But Isaac keeps his spoken word limited almost entirely to when he's conversing with other people. The other members of the Kellian crew, Kendra Daniels and Zach Hammond, have been recast, now played by Brigitte Kali Canales and Anthony Alabi, respectively, and they do just as good a job as their predecessors. Their personalities differ from the characters' original portrayals, especially Kendra, who is noticeably less confrontational. The trio of Isaac, Kendra, and Hammond plays to a much better dynamic here in the remake than it did before, because now Isaac feels like less of a robot being bossed around and more like a participating member of a team. Then we have Farhan Tahir, who is Chalice Mercer, the game's primary human antagonist, who knocks it out of the park and makes the character much more sinister and cunning. Regarding the game's story, there's a lot more supplementary material here than ever before. The remake is loaded with text logs, audio logs, and references to other Dead Space media, including games and other content that came out after the original Dead Space did. Motive had a lot of world-building material to pull from, and they did not waste any opportunities. A staple in the survival horror genre is finding remnants of the past through lore items, and they're all over the place here. Some details are even worked directly into the main story. I won't go into detail here because it's arguably spoiler territory, and because I also want people to experience the small but significant new story content on their own. Graphically, Dead Space looks fantastic. The USG Ishimura truly feels like a place people once lived in, with every room being dense with assets. The original game looked great for its time too, and was lauded for its production value, including its moody atmosphere, and the remake totally stands up to that. The art direction stays just as strong while ramping up the detail and improving the lighting. Shadows and darkness feel more oppressive than ever, and light sources feel like sanctuaries, even if the actual room might not be one. If you haven't touched the original in a long time, you would think you remember it looking this dark, but the remake almost makes the original look blindingly bright in comparison. The game uses its lighting techniques to highlight important focal points in the environment all the better, while still positively contributing to the dread and feelings of imminent doom. You can feel claustrophobic even in rooms that are pretty large, simply because of the abyssal blackness enveloping you. One huge change is to the necromorphs. They still look horrific and disgusting and repulsive, but a massive visual and mechanical addition is the peeling mechanic. Sounds gross, because it is. What the peeling mechanic does is give a visual representation of how much damage you're doing to the necromorphs by stripping away clothing, skin, and flesh, leaving only bone until you finally kill the enemy. Not only does this drive up the gore factor of the game, but it also serves as a diegetic health bar for the monsters. This is genius because Isaac has a diegetic health bar too, the iconic meter on the back of his suit, so why shouldn't enemies have one too? I played the game on PS5, and the game has a performance mode that lowers resolution and detail just a tad to hit a consistent 60 frames per second, and a non-performance mode that lets the game run at higher resolution at 30 frames per second. Funnily enough, on launch, the non-performance mode actually ran at about 40 to 50 frames per second, even hitting 60 on rare occasions. But the day one patch capped it at 30. Granted, a consistent 30 is preferable to a wildly varying 30 to 50 that dips and rises all the damn time, causing obvious judder because of the uneven frame timing. However, the performance mode maintains a rock-solid 60 for damn near 100% of the time. If there's any negatives to speak on regarding graphics and performance, it would have to be the variable rate shading, or VRS, which is a technique that allows developers to select portions of a frame to render at max quality and other regions to render at sub-max quality. This saves on rendering power so that the spots of the screen that players are most likely to be looking at are the spots that look the best. In theory, this is a great idea, but in practice, it's kinda spotty. While writing the review for the game, Motive released an update that improved it significantly, but for the first few days of the game's availability, it was pretty rough looking. On assets near the edge of the screen or perhaps in certain distances from the camera, the VRS was really obvious because it gives the illusion of severe blurriness or low resolution. I've seen other reviewers on YouTube thinking it was the dynamic resolution tanking, but in reality it was the VRS looking pretty ugly. Again, a patch came out removing the horrible blurring effect and the visuals have improved a head-spinning amount, so it's not as big of a deal now. I know PC players are thankful for the fix because it looked even worse on there. Another thing for PC players to keep in mind is that the game was made with the assumption that you have an SSD. So if you're still playing games on a hard disk drive in 2023, you can expect the game to stutter as it loads assets while you're playing. Speaking of SSDs, the game loads your most recent save seamlessly once you enter the main menu on startup, meaning you can see your game loaded up in the background before you even press continue. Then the game just switches to it with zero extra wait. Beyond that, the only time you'll ever experience load times in the game is when you die and get sent back to a checkpoint, which can take a little longer than most other games I've played on PS5, but nothing to complain about, so long as you're not dying too often. The game also has extensive accessibility options, which is always nice. But the content warning feature that throws a pop-up on the top right corner of the screen every single time you're about to see or hear something potentially unsavory feels like an odd thing to put into a game where the moment-to-moment action is quite possibly the most violently gory dismemberment your money can buy right now, thanks to the gleefully disgusting peeling system. I'd really like to know if there is someone out there who truly feels like they need these odd warnings in the middle of an already grotesque game, but I guess more options is better than less. And then, of course, there's the audio. Audio design is extremely important to horror games. In fact, I think it's pretty safe to say it's even more important than graphics. This is another spot the original Dead Space excelled in, and I'm glad to say the remake does too. Mixed in with the periodic, heart-stopping environmental ambient sounds of the metallic clinks and clangs of the Ishimura's metal hull is the blood-curdling screams of nearby necromorphs that may or may not actually smash their way out of the ducts to eviscerate you. The sounds of Dead Space are a huge contributor to making the USG Ishimura a character in itself instead of just a setting. The massive derelict ship feels alive from the machinery and electronics, both in contrast and complement to its terribly destroyed interior. The vents rumble with activity from nasty reanimated enemies both near and far, adding layers of tension as you walk through the barely lit corridors, wondering if you're going to get grabbed when you turn the next corner. It's fantastic. God have mercy on those who play with headphones. Now let's finally dive into the meat and potatoes of any good survival horror experience: the gameplay. And I truly do mean survival horror, because the Dead Space remake makes great strides in closing that gap that caused people to argue if the original version was true survival horror or simply action horror. I used the first iteration of the game as an example of action horror in my What is Survival Horror video, citing its linearity and focus on combat as reasons. But the remake is much more nuanced now, providing new content that shifts the game's subgenre leanings. First and foremost is probably the biggest change to the experience: the expanded layout of the USG Ishimura and how to explore it. For anyone who hasn't played the original or perhaps hasn't played it in a long time, the remake might seem to not change much at first glance, but that would be the wrong assumption to make. In the original game, the ship's map design was very linear, Diverging paths were somewhat few and far between, and if you came across them, the non-progression path only led to a small room of loot or something, and then you would backtrack briefly to go the other way and carry on. As intense and atmospheric as the ship was, there was nothing particularly major going on with its actual floor plan. Furthermore, progress through the story, and the ship, was only facilitated through the tram, which would take Isaac to other sectors of the Ishimura, and usually not allow him to go back to past areas unless it was required. The remake changes all of this, completely and utterly. The USG Ishimura now feels much more comparable to other famous survival horror locations like the Spencer Mansion and RPD Station, due to how much more open and borderline labyrinthine it is now. Motive Studio went out of their way to not only add more rooms and more corridors, but they even made the different sectors of the ship accessible on foot. The tram still exists, but now it mostly serves as just a fast travel mechanism. This means the entire ship is open to you, and you can go back to previously visited areas to your heart's content. And you will want to do that because another fantastic change to the game is the clearance system. In the original game, certain doors were locked and could only be opened by using nodes. In some cases, you had to spend those nodes then and there because you might not be able to return to that door later. In the remake, however, these doors are now locked behind levels of clearance that Isaac obtains as he continues through the ship. This means there's lots of rooms with a ton of useful resources waiting for you to grab so long as you remember to go out of your way and backtrack to these doors, just like any survival horror game would have you do. Remember in the original game, there were tons of lockers and storage boxes with red lights on them? It felt like it would be possible to find a key to open them, but there wasn't. Until the remake, that is. Now those closed lockers and boxes can be opened, and it only makes exploration that much more rewarding. In fact, the game giving you rewards for exploring it is another topic in itself. In the original game, it felt like you absolutely needed to rely on killing enemies to obtain the lion's share of items you get, which is what pushed it further into action horror territory. But the remake throws so much stuff at you for simply walking around and interacting with the environment, I have a feeling that getting through the game without ever stomping on enemy corpses for extra drops is more possible now than it ever was. In fact, that might be a cool modifier to add to the game officially. No more stomp drops. Then, in relation to the level design, there's the actual in-game map. It's a much more functional, readable 2D map than the weird and unintuitive 3D map the original had. I almost never used it, instead opting for just the locator. In the remake, I found myself relying on both, but honestly you could just remap the locator button to directly open the map instead, and it would serve the same purpose, because the blue or yellow locator line that helps you find your way is also seen on the map. If there's one feature it's missing, it's the ability to permanently set your own markers down for places of interest that aren't already noted by the game itself. And then there's the Intensity Director, which is essentially a random event generator system that causes different things to happen in different rooms you visit or revisit. For example, when you enter a room or corridor, the lights might go out, and Isaac gets swallowed by total darkness for about 30 seconds, but it feels like an eternity. Or you might hear the vents start to rattle violently, accompanied by an ear-ripping shriek in the distance. And the scary thing is, it's a total coin flip if this event results in an actual enemy spawn or not. It keeps you on your toes because you don't know what to expect any more than Isaac does. It's a system that really ramps up the thrills, as its name states. Oh, and I mentioned a yellow locator line a moment ago, and it's because that one leads you to side mission progress. Yeah, the remake expands the game to the point where there's side missions now, with their own line of objectives. And they're not just shallow time wasters, they are lore-heavy expository missions that provide greater insight to the events leading up to the infestation and how the unitologists are involved. They also give some good rewards. Again, I won't go into detail, but I will say it's absolutely worth doing them while you're going through your first run of the game. Basically, the overall design and layout of the Ishimura, as well as the content within and incentives for exploring, have all been overhauled to such an incredible degree, and so much for the better. It makes the game feel like both a remake of the original and a theoretical Dead Space 1.5 put together. It's insane. The USG Ishimura is no longer just a series of levels. It's now a fully realized world, with so much extra character and depth carefully sculpted into each sector. It finally feels as gargantuan as it should as a planet-cracking ship. Quite frankly, this is enough for me to say that this remake is an improvement over the original, and I wholeheartedly recommend everyone play it. I would feel completely content in stopping my review here, but I won't. Believe it or not, we still have even more to talk about. Let's discuss combat, and everything relating to it. Isaac has an impressive arsenal available to him as he treks through the nightmarish Ishimura. All the weapons from the original make a return, including the iconic plasma cutter, the intense ripper, and of course, Isaac's 100-pound lead boots. But one key difference here in the remake is how they are upgraded. I mentioned nodes earlier, and how they're no longer used to open doors. That means they're now exclusively used for upgrading your suit and weapons on their respective upgrade trees. Furthermore, the remake totally disposes of empty upgrade slots on those trees, meaning no nodes are wasted. Every time you spend a node, you spend it on something that's actually tangible. Extra health for your engineering suit, extra capacity for the pulse rifle, faster reload speed for the contact beam, larger magazine for the line gun. Nodes are completely dedicated to improvements. And yes, that means the upgrade trees themselves are even bigger than they were in the original game too, in order to make use of all the nodes you'll get. And yes, you can respec whenever you want. Motive didn't take the lazy way out by simply cutting out a ton of nodes and keeping the upgrade trees the same size. When they set out to expand the game, they didn't stop at the map. They expanded everything. Each gun also has expanded or different functionalities from their first iteration. The Force gun now has a gravity well that pulls in enemies. The Ripper's blades can now ricochet to hit multiple enemies or perhaps hit one enemy multiple times. Useful for brutes. The pulse rifle replaced its fuck everything spinning turret fire with a much more precise sticky grenade. So on and so forth. Weapons are given just as much additional utility and personality as the map design, and it's worth revisiting them all, even the ones you probably didn't like in the original game. Movement was expanded too, specifically spacewalking. In the original game, Isaac only leapt from one point to another and never actually floated. This was changed in the remake, and now he can fly around with these small jets on his suit, and even spin around to the left or right to realign himself. Granted, I still wouldn't say it's ideal in all circumstances because it can easily become disorienting or just plain annoying when you're getting sniped by an enemy and can't tell where they're coming from. But it's still an improvement. Among other noteworthy changes is the asteroid shooting section. You may remember this moment in the original Dead Space as a minigame where Isaac sits in a chair and controls cannons to shoot asteroids out of the way of the Ishimura to prevent any disastrous crashes. You may also remember that this minigame was a fucking nightmare, especially for console players who had to use an analog stick to aim. It was a terrible minigame and was borderline impossible for anyone using a controller, especially on higher difficulties. It was such a tiny part of the game, yet it would end up being a fucking wall, for no real reason. Thankfully, Motive Studio understood this and completely overhauled it into an awesome set piece using normal gameplay that simply has Isaac wander across the exterior of the ship to manually aim each cannon for a few shots to calibrate it for automatic aiming. It's such an improvement that even if this were the only change the remake made besides making the game prettier, I would say it's enough to make it better than the original. I really disliked that minigame. Then there's the circuit breaker mechanic, which involves rerouting power from one piece of machinery to another. It functions in multiple ways. It's usually a way of making progress to the next room, but it's also occasionally an important choice. For example, in an early area, you must choose between sacrificing the lights or life support on your way out of a necromorph-infested room, meaning you have to choose between sprinting through with dwindling air supply or slowly trekking through utter darkness. Hell of a choice. Next, there's New Game Plus, a staple feature for any decent survival horror game. It's here, it works exactly like it should, and it's great. What else could you ask for? Well, how about extra optional story content and additional rewards for completing it? Seriously, even New Game Plus has awesome stuff to discover, and it's usually something people do strictly for the sake of it. Relating to that, there's also Impossible Mode, which uses hard mode's balancing but adds an extra, ultra-dangerous element. If you die, your save file is wiped and you have to restart from the beginning or choose to continue on regular hard mode. It's a huge challenge where one mistake can cost hours of playtime, but if you're up for it, then it's there. In fact, Dead Space has a ton of potential for cool challenge runs. It even maintains tradition by having a trophy or achievement for beating the game using just the plasma cutter, which you realize is actually extremely doable once you give it a shot. So far, everything about this review has been extremely positive. Is there anything not so positive to say about the game? Well, I have some things, both nitpicks and actual significant stuff. The very personal nitpick is basically the fact that I hate dealing with the Guardians, those enemies that are stuck to walls, shoot little spit-throwing tentacle turrets, and insta-kill you when you get too close. I groan every time I realize I'm about to deal with one. But that's just me. The actual big thing to touch on is occasional glitches. The worst one I've encountered is a weird camera bug that happens when you load your last save too quickly and the camera stays stationary while you still have full control of Isaac. Weird, but nothing that a reload can't fix. I've personally run into one particularly nasty bug that could spell a premature and unavoidable doom to one's playthrough if the conditions are right. It is rare, but it happens. I have already seen mentions and footage of bad checkpoint or save states where Isaac is hit or even killed upon loading by a newly spawned enemy in the room before the player gains control of him. Meaning that as soon as you load in, Isaac is attacked or straight up turned into mincemeat before you can do anything about it. And this can result in a soft lock of the game where you're stuck in a loop of death and the only way out is reloading an even earlier save. I had a close call with this myself near the ass end of the game, where I loaded in and immediately heard a necromorph beating the shit out of Isaac before I could even move him. Watch and listen carefully. If Isaac had low enough health in this save state to have been killed before I gained control, I would have been stuck in a death loop and forced to start a new game because I, stupidly, was not rotating save slots. So don't make unnecessary risks like me, and rotate those save slots, people. Worst case scenario, this happens to you in a run through impossible mode where you're continuing a save you made the previous night or something. Seriously, I've seen footage of that happening too. I hope Motive does something to fix this because even if it's rare or easily avoidable by just rotating saves, a bug like this will definitely result in a poor controller somewhere getting spiked into the ground. Other than that, I really have nothing else to complain about. The general experience of the game is just unassailably fantastic. Overall, the Dead Space remake is the new gold standard for video game remakes everywhere. It takes the original, maintains every major component that made it so special, but added extra content and nuance to both the narrative and the gameplay to create a new experience that's just as worthwhile today as the original was back in 2008. Perhaps even more so. It's fun, it's scary, it's deep, it's beautiful, it's grotesque, and it's incredible. It is the best remake since Resident Evil for the GameCube, and that's not a position that's given up easily. Because Resident Evil has undoubtedly held onto that title of best remake for 21 years now, and for good reason. It would take nothing short of utter brilliance or practical perfection to get another remake of equal quality. But here it is. Motive Studio did what many people thought would be improbable, if not borderline impossible. They took a modern classic and made it sincerely better in every way that counts. It feels better, looks better, sounds better, and most importantly, there's more of it. They display respect and love of the original while bringing forward new ideas they felt would be improvements, and they made the right calls across the board. I am truly, wholeheartedly relieved that Motive Studio had greater ambitions than just a complacent copy-paste of the original game. They wanted to add, not just mimic. They wanted to pleasantly surprise us, not just reaffirm our love of the original. And don't get me wrong, the original game is still good, even for today's standards, and I recommend giving it a shot too if you haven't. But the remake is yet another argument for why video game remakes should be allowed to happen, even if the original is still available. Because, even against all odds, they're sometimes just better. Even beyond Motive's great work, there's the small miracle of EA deciding, against character, to not mar the game with unnecessary monetization or chopping up some of its content to sell as small DLC packs 2 months from now or even on day one. Because of their decision to back off, Dead Space feels more like a whole, realized, and pure experience. Hopefully this is behavior that will stay persistent, but I think I know better than to expect that. And finally, before we close this review out, there's a bit of an elephant in the room that some people might want to address. I am not actively looking to create a rivalry between Dead Space and the Callisto Protocol, since they can absolutely coexist in peace. But considering the relationship these two games have with each other and the thematic, not mechanic, similarities that they have, I think a lot of people will be comparing and contrasting them anyway. I've already done a review of the Callisto Protocol, and if you've seen it, then you already know that I wasn't particularly happy with it. So if you ask me to choose one or the other, then the choice would be insultingly obvious. I would choose Dead Space. This isn't to say that I think Callisto is irredeemable trash or anything. I saw the rare glimpse of brilliance in it, but striking distance didn't polish the other spots that needed it. To go into greater detail, there isn't a single gameplay-related aspect that the Callisto Protocol holds over Dead Space. Dead Space has better and more engaging combat with an arsenal of excellent and distinct weapons. Dead Space has far superior map design that encourages exploration and backtracking for goodies. And Dead Space also has better incentive to go through New Game Plus. Also, Dead Space is actually scary. If there's one thing the Callisto Protocol has going for it, it's probably just graphical fidelity. But even that isn't a huge win, because Dead Space still looks fantastic in its own right. Otherwise, Callisto is just a hyperlinear game with shallow melee-focused combat that evolves very little, if at all, as the game progresses. And it didn't even launch with New Game Plus included. It became available a month later in an update, after everyone voiced their disappointment in the game at such a foundational level that the new mode wouldn't really fix anything in the long term. Honestly, after the release of Dead Space, it should be even clearer to everyone now how disappointing Callisto was. I know I'm sounding super hard on the game, but as I said, it's not without its promising aspects. If Striking Distance is able to get a sequel greenlit and they actually listen to feedback, then a second game could be truly fantastic. I can sense it. Callisto Protocol has traces of a great game's DNA floating around inside of it. The studio just needs to manifest it better. But as it stands, right this moment, I don't think I could give the Callisto Protocol another shot anytime soon. Because I know that if I start it up again and begin playing, I'm just going to immediately start thinking I could be playing Dead Space instead. This concludes my review of the Dead Space remake. The question that now remains is if Motive will do anything else with the franchise, and if so, what will it be? A remake of Dead Space 2, or go straight to Dead Space 4? Guess we'll have to wait and see. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.